As Green spokesperson for LGBTQIA+, I indicate that the Greens will be supporting the Conversion Practices Ban Bill 2024, as well as seeking amendment to strengthen the bill. Conversion practices are founded on the dangerous falsehood that LGBTQA+ people are broken or disordered, and that we can and should be treated or corrected. There is no medical basis for conversion practices. Sexuality and gender identity are not choices that can be changed. Conversion practices shouldn't be referred to as therapy because there is nothing therapeutic about them. Bans of these practices have been slowly rolling out since the UN called for a global ban in 2020. Victoria, the Australian Capital Territory, and New Zealand have outlawed conversion practices. We are here debating this bill today because of the tireless work of victim survivors who have advocated for many years to ensure that no one will have to go through what they have endured. There is a misconception by some that conversion practices are a thing of the past, but conversion practices are indeed taking place in New South Wales in 2024. Peer-reviewed Australian research undertaken in 2019 has shown that 4% of LGBTQA+ Australians aged between 14 and 21 years have experienced conversion practices. This is a conservative estimate, and with the inclusion of informal practices, this could be as high as 10%. In 2022, when Victoria was drafting its legislation to ban conversion practices, at least 10 organisations in Australia and New Zealand were found to be publicly advertising these practices. Previous generations endured conversion practices with overtly cruel interventions like electroshock therapy. But modern conversion practices look duplicitously like care. They look like psychology or counselling sessions, exorcism, people being prayed over, and celibacy groups. As many survivors of conversion practices have shared, this so-called therapy doesn't change anyone's sexuality or gender identity. What it has done is wear down people's self-esteem, made them believe that there's something wrong with them, that they're possessed by demons, that they are failures for not having been able to change. Conversion practices have made people hate themselves and believe that they are better off dead than being same-sex attracted or gender diverse. The Australian Medical Association have stated, quote, "There is strong agreement among the medical profession in Australia that conversion practices have no medical benefit or scientific basis, and that there is evidence of significant harms resulting from such practices," end quote. Of course, there is no voice more important in this debate than the voices of victim survivors of conversion practices. I thank every survivor who bravely shared their story with members of Parliament and the broader community, and note the testimonies that were shared during the debate in the Legislative Assembly yesterday of Eamon, Samuel, Anthony and Dawn, and the testimonies that were shared by the Leader of the Government in this debate. I'd like to share some of the testimony of Jeremy Smith. He says, quote, "I grew up in the conservative Catholic sect Opus Dei. The school I went to was an environment rife with homophobia. We were taught that sexually active gay people were intrinsically morally evil and destined for hell. The school's motto, 'The truth will set you free,' was cruelly ironic given that myself and others were told to not only hide and repress our true sexuality, but to also change it. After I came out to my mum as gay at 16, she told my school tutor without my knowledge. I remember a conversation with my tutor in which he said I must never act on my attraction to other boys. My parents took me to a child psychiatrist who offered me therapy to suppress my attraction to boys. I declined this therapy. Then my parents took me to see a Jesuit Catholic priest. I remember being taken to this priest against my will, crying in the car on the way to and during the session. This therapy would involve prayer if I had impure thoughts, methods to force myself to not act on my sexuality, and conversations about the implications of being gay on my eternal soul. I remember nights trying to hold my breath to make any sexual arousal go away. I remember nights where I would cry myself to sleep, thinking that I was sinful and destined to be damned to hell. After a few sessions, I remember being in the car with my mum on the way home, breaking down crying, saying I was growing to hate a part of myself. Although my brush with conversion practices was only fleeting, it has left lasting scars. Conversion practices of all kinds encourage dark thought patterns and self-loathing, and the protections must extend to gender-diverse people given the high rates of suicide for young trans people. I have since received real therapy in my 20s that helped me overcome the trauma of the conversion therapy I experienced. You wouldn't send your child to places that promote eating disorders or self-harm, and yet that is exactly what conversion practices are, a form of self-harm. These practices must be outlawed to save lives. Another person with a valuable story is Ace Leeson. Quote, "As a teenager, when I realised I was attracted to women, I did what was expected, and that was go to church leaders. I told my youth pastor, and she said to me, God has a plan for your life. And if you choose the wrong path, if you date women, you will only find death and destruction. So I tried to follow God's path for the next 15 years. God's path was prayer camps where demons were cast out of me, confession meetings with my church leaders, studying ex-gay ministry materials, and even installing spyware on my computer. I was also encouraged to get married, which didn't work out. But in having my kid, I had the opportunity to meet people outside of the church, including a happy lesbian couple who had kids. That was mind-blowing for me to see that being queer didn't have to mean destruction, but that I could be myself and be happy," end quote. Thank you to Jeremy and Ace and other survivors who have retold their personal trauma over and over again, who have helped the Parliament and the community to understand the profound negative impact of conversion practices. I also acknowledge the many survivors listening tonight who are not able to relive or share their trauma in this way. The bill defines a conversion practice as a practice, treatment, or sustained effort that is directed to an individual on the basis of the individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, and directed to changing or suppressing the individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. The inclusion of gender identity is welcome, recognising the unique vulnerability of trans and gender diverse people who face some of the worst discrimination in our communities. Importantly, it includes suppression as a form of conversion practice, which is critical when this is the form of many modern conversion practices and can be just as harmful. The definition proposed in the bill includes a specific exception for an expression that a belief or principle ought to be followed or applied. The Greens believe that the definition and this exclusion means that some harmful practices will not be captured by the bill, and we'll be moving an amendment to address this. The bill sets out both a criminal offence and civil complaint scheme to address conversion practices. A criminal penalty is appropriate where there is evidence of substantial mental or physical harm, noting this can be cumulative. The most important change that this bill will drive in New South Wales is not that significant numbers of people will be criminalised, it's that a very clear deterrent is set that can prevent harm from taking place. This is about protecting LGBTQA+ people, and particularly LGBTQA+ people of faith who are most likely to be subjected to these practices. I understand that the civil complaint scheme has been modelled on the provisions of the Anti-Discrimination Act. This complaints mechanism requires the identification of a named and consenting complainant. However, survivors can take years, if ever, before being well enough to reach out for help to make a complaint, let alone make a complaint themselves. Many never realise that they're survivors. The Greens will also be moving an amendment to improve the ability of third parties to report conversion practices. It is a great indignity to survivors, their supporters, and LGBTQIA+ people watching, with bated breath for the government to have moved this important legislation in the manner that they have. This Labor government took a year to introduce this legislation, and this bill was scheduled last on today's agenda. I acknowledge those who've been here for many hours for this debate to start at 11 o'clock at night. I'm hopeful that the bill passes tonight. This is an important and overdue change that will save lives. But what's next for LGBTQIA+ people to be able to participate fully in community life, free from discrimination in New South Wales? New South Wales will still have the worst laws in the country for LGBTQIA+ people, with people who are bisexual like me, intersex or non-binary not protected by the Anti-Discrimination Act. New South Wales still requires people to undergo violating and medically unnecessary genital surgery to be able to change their gender on official documents. We are still performing unnecessary surgery on kids born with variation of sex characteristics that cause long-term harm. The recommendations of the Special Commission of Inquiry into LGBTIQ hate crimes haven't been implemented, and we don't have a minister or a commissioner to drive and coordinate the reform that we need. Tonight, hopefully, we take one big step forward. Let's relegate conversion practices to the dustbin of history where they belong. I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you.